So this is the first time she's actually held this class. Yeah. I've been subjected for a year now. I'm getting used to it. We're not even going to let you be in it. Pull out all your improv experience and go for it. Yeah, this came out in 2015, but it breaks down teams and looks at pair relationships and identifies over a dozen different kinds of pairs that look like all the way from Gotcha 6 to distant pairs. Gotcha 6 is what's guarding under Ronstadt's dressing room to make sure that nobody went in. We never went in either, but if she had one, we knew there hadn't been anybody in that wasn't supposed to be all the way to the distant pair where one person is just used by another as a mobile. That's right. So it's something to mirror, but it goes through the anthropology and those things. And then it starts focusing on diversity. There's a book out by Scott Lee called Diversity Bonus. He talked about why things work better. The bonus is as we get diversity, but the penalty you have to pay is that diversity causes friction and causes things to fall up. So, since the Eagles have been introduced, they've been used as an example. Well, that'd be another example. Yes, exactly. Oh, because their album that was the top selling album.
And I don't know.
Top selling album.
Is that just about like, are we asking?
I don't even remember which one. So remind me I could have a lot of I still have 30 days before the talks.
Is it or is it where it rotates on?
I'm going to have about 80 slides for 10 minutes. If I get that far. Right. Oh, yeah.
Which is really frustrating. But this guy did.
Have you ever seen the slides before? Boston had wrap up. They got volunteers to come out and go through a slide randomly, and they basically
I mean, I haven't attempted to
yes, teams who didn't have appears in those other troubles, and then some participants do.
through that, I've met people like
Yeah, through the Badger and Sam, which is part of Boston.
I mean, they don't speak something.
I'm afraid it's outside of the space. Yes. Yes. I'm
It is.
Team Genius is the name of the shop. And the other one is Team Genius, so I haven't had time to.
So, it was insightful, because
It's there to support the conversation, but it's really good.
it's no,
It's starting to like this partner
but it does make me wonder. Yeah. Because there were other things that
he's involved with Capital Factory.
Yeah, right, support.
And so, but that's the thing. I'm starting to wonder as to
Yeah, it actually had a big twist on it. Track. Which one am I supposed to
You have something that you like. And I think also Capital Factory is very, like, as long as you have like a clear structure, as long as yeah, as long as there's space for it. I think it's great for
there are a bajillion
connections.
they have fun ones, right? So that you can go like, I can't see you.
That's the whole thing about it. Is each day has one set items. So you have to go to all four.
And they're like, I am starting to
Yeah, after I found the copy that they had.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you all coming out. This is a special treat tonight. AJ and I have been talking for a while about working together, how we might collaborate. The work that she does is adjacent to the work that Voltage Control does, and we think there's a lot of potential there. So kind of kicked it off this last week with a blog post, and then she's going to be speaking tonight at the meetup. So looking forward to her presentation for sure. And I just have a few announcements that I'd like to share with you. So first of all, Eli, our prototyper and facilitator, is hosting a meetup called a Design Jam. So the idea is, it's kind of, he might shoot me for saying this, but it's kind of like a hackathon. It's like a design version of a hackathon. So you get together during kind of meetup time of day in the evenings and start to think about a challenge or a proposal and just kind of design it together. And it draws some inspiration from design sprints. So some of the sketch activities that you would see on a Tuesday during a design sprint. Oh, and I should probably tell you the date, if in case you couldn't read it. It's September the 6th. What time is that, Eli?
Starts at 7.
Starts at 7. And that's here at Capital Factory.
That's tomorrow, by the way.
Yes, that is tomorrow. Thank you. And on Friday, September 7th, we're doing an AI readiness workshop. And it's based off of a new framework that we developed at Voltage Control. And it resembles the business model canvas, but we're calling it the AI readiness canvas. So instead of focusing on the deep technology of AI, it's talking about the intersection of the business needs and technology and the data. So let's from a business standpoint, even explore if we're mature enough to even start to embark on this stuff and what things we might need to put in place to get there. Also, next Thursday, September 13th at Native, we're hosting Jake Knapp, the author of the book, Design Sprint. And that's going to be incredible. If you've never met him, he is a total treat. And tonight we're going to give away 2 tickets. And in order to be eligible for the 2 tickets, you have to go to facebook.com/voltagecontrol, like the page, and share the pinned post at the top. And that pinned post is a post pointing to the event. So if you do those 2 things, you'll be entered, and we're going to give away the ticket at the end of the meetup. Also, at the end of the workshop, so if you attend the workshop, you get a signed copy of Design Sprint as well as a signed copy of Jake's new book, Make Time. And Make Time is kind of a greatest hits of kind of how to focus your time and energy, so time management tools and attention management. And it's very similar to what he did with design thinking. So he took a bunch of stuff and kind of condensed it down into a very structured process. It's a really great book. I'm really excited. And we're going to have it 2 weeks before the official launch. And so for those of you that are interested but can't afford the full ticket to the workshop, we've got a few extra copies, and we're going to be selling those for $30 a piece. So if you're interested, we didn't create a short URL or anything. Just see me or Eli, and we can get your name and make sure you get access to it, to the Eventbrite for that. And Product Camp, Austin's coming up. Eli and I are both. This is an unconference, so there's no guarantee we're going to be speaking, but we love this conference. If you're product-minded at all, it's a lot of fun. You can come and vote on the presentations and hopefully see the things you're most excited about. Also, on their website, you can look at all the proposals. So the things that are going to be voted on are all up there on Product Camp's website. And this will be the 21st one they've done. Also, Google Sprint Conference is happening the first 3 days of October. I'll be speaking at that conference, and so it's also an unconference, but there's a few slots that they've actually selected speakers for. So if you're going to be in San Francisco and are interested in coming, it's a private event, but come talk to me, and I can probably get you admission if what you work on is relevant. Also, next month for the Design Sprint meetup, we have running multiple sprints at Apple. Sarah Alto McAllister is going to be presenting about how they run multiple consecutive design sprints to get at kind of a deep requirements alignment process. And then I'll be doing the AI readiness workshop again at a conference in October. It's a CTO conference, so if you have any CTOs in the room, or if you know a CTO that might be interested, it's a really fun conference. And Eli will be doing a digital prototyping workshop for the UXPA, and that's going to be on November 10th, and the location's to be determined, so stay tuned for that. And with no further ado, I would like to welcome AJ. Thank you so much, AJ. You need this?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate everyone coming out, especially with the rain on its way. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experiences at Google and since Google, working with sprints and some adaptations that my team and I have made along the way. So just a quick quote here from Jake, who, as Douglas just said, is going to be in town. So please go to that, fill out the Facebook form now if you haven't done it yet. Even if you're wrong the first time, the sprint process will help you light up your future path. I think that's applicable to thinking about the sprint process itself. So we're going to do something pretty meta today, where we're going to apply some sprint principles to the way that we sprint. At Google, I worked on a couple of different teams as a UX researcher or user experience researcher. I worked on both products that were consumer-facing and several that were B2B. I worked on products that went from a 5-day sprint week, and that product made it to an alpha launch while I was working on that team. And I also worked on products that had been in the market for 15 plus years. So it's a really established user base, really established user needs, but still needed the sprint to add some innovation and improvements to the experience. I've also worked as the sole researcher on these products. I've worked in teams of researchers, both where I'm a sole researcher on individual products, but have other researchers who have the same subject expertise. And I've also done collaboration with research. So if anyone's interested in how to play with different numbers of researchers, when you'd want to do those things, happy to talk through that. And then the last thing is methodology. So in the research land, we talk about formative research, learning about your customers, really understanding those root problems and root needs at the beginning. And then evaluative research, which is what you do during sprints. It's where you take a look at the product that you're designing or that you already have built and evaluate how it's doing, identify problems that you can continue to solve. Since my time at Google, I've started my own agency in town. It's called Sitlio. We are an experience optimization company, and we help companies improve their customer experiences. So this is the traditional sprint structure. How many people in the room have done a sprint before? Looks like most people. And then how many people have done like the full 5-day sprint? Probably some overlap there. So just a quick run through of what the overall view of that 5 days is. Day 1, you map out your goals for the week. You talk about the problems. You work together to identify what your goals are. Day 2, usually a Tuesday, you start sketching out designs. Everyone on the team has a chance to participate. All ideas are good ideas, and you are waiting to decide on which solution you're going with till day 3. On Thursday, typically you'll be prototyping a solution that then you'll test with customers on Friday. So that's just like the baseline traditional sprint structure that most teams use. So, fun surprise, today we're gonna be doing a bunch of exercises. You're not just gonna be listening to me. So I want everyone to partner up. A couple of rules. It can't be somebody that you work with, because I want you to have had different experiences with sprints. So find someone, either someone you're sitting next to, introduce yourself, name, company, your favorite brunch food, and then turn back here so I know you're done. Feel free to shuffle seats if you need to. Exercises after this, so if I just cut you off from a really interesting topic, you're going to have plenty of time to continue talking. But we will get started with Discuss It number 1. I want you to talk with your partner or your small group. How closely did you follow the traditional sprint structure in the last sprint that you did? So those 5 days that we just reviewed. And if you haven't done a sprint before or you haven't done one recently, talk about maybe what's keeping your team from doing sprints right now.
Is it general sprint or design specific sprint?
Just doing a sprint. So have you done a 5-day sprint
So it
with
could
your
be
team?
agile software sprint.
Anything you want. Just talk about what it looks like. It's very open-ended. This is an intro to what you know. But you're gonna get a lot of
You said like you were
Oh, it's so nice. Douglas, it's awesome. All right. I hope that was an interesting conversation. So as a researcher, I also wanted to just highlight when research typically happens in a design sprint. So I would label 3 different sections of the 5-day sprint where a researcher has responsibility or research-like activities happen. So on Monday, in the typical 5-day sprint, you have expert interviews. And that's typically where you're interviewing someone either within the company who has expertise. I've also done it where we have an outside expert come. For example, I was working on an app where we were working with soldiers who had PTSD, and we did not bring the soldiers in, but instead we brought the therapists that work with the soldiers. And that to me is like a subject matter expert. They know that person way better than I know them. They know that population's needs, and they can be a stand-in as an expert and represent multiple viewpoints. On Tuesday in the sprint week, the manual will tell you that's when you start scheduling participants. Typically, kind of you think about in the afternoon, you've already decided what your problem is, who the audience is going to be. You start scheduling people about 4 days in advance to get them lined up for Friday's interviews. The book calls them interviews with customers. At Google, sometimes we talked about them being prototype testing or usability testing, but generally the goals are the same. You have a prototype, you have a user with needs, and you're trying to understand where the gaps are between those needs and the solution you've come up with. Oh, discuss it number 2. We're already up on number 2. Number 2, so let's talk about researching your sprints. So sometimes research doesn't happen, and sometimes there's a lot of research that goes into a sprint. So talk to your partner, talk about, did you have the research at all? Did you hit these kind of 3 points? Or did you have any other types of research that came in during your sprint? And then the second part of that is, while you were sprinting, is there anything that you wish you had known about your customer that you didn't know and you never learned across that week? So go ahead and spend a few minutes talking about those points. Alright, so I'm curious, outside of expert reviews and interviews with customers, were there some other types of like customer data that got surfaced in sprints? Yeah.
So contextual inquiries to see if people are using, how people use similar solutions.
Contextual inquiries, what was the context? Were they like in a workplace or at home, or was it verbal, like description of it?
It was a combination of a verbal explanation and you know, at their workplace. I mean, they're using mobile apps, so.
Nice. Anyone else? Yeah?
Kind of like stakeholder, like mini keynote speeches. We always do that for our sprints. We have people from each department give like a 10-minute talk about where their focus is. You know, if it's the developers, and then we have the stakeholders, and they'll call out like their perspective, and then like what they're hoping for and what their perspective is on the sprint going forward.
And for the specific problems?
Right, exactly.
tackling?
And they'll
Okay.
kind of, if it's marketing, they'll talk about the more business side of the problem. If it's, you know, so they each have kind of their own expertise, and they get like kind of I don't know, like we call it like mini keynote, but it can be, it's just like an informative 10-minute talk,
Nice.
lightning talk, yeah.
Yeah. Any other forms of customer or team research? Nice. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about, before we talk about ways to overhaul the overall structure, I want to talk about the research specifically. I think there are times when people exclude research because it can be time consuming to schedule. It might be confusing to know like who you should be recruiting on Tuesday for Friday, and things might change. There's a lot of unknowns about how to connect with customers and all these kinds of things. So there's a couple of options for what you can do. They're pretty obvious in this setup. You can do it before the sprint. So some of the research or stakeholder interviews you might do on Monday, you can bump that up, the timeline up, and get some of that done. Get the team kind of thinking about the problem before you even get into the sprint week. And then another obvious choice, then the opposite, after the sprint. So, you know, the research that happens on Friday, as a researcher, I've never done. I think any product could be infinitely researched. I don't think it's always worth the time cost of that, but the iterations have value in themselves, and I'll talk a little bit later on about how to decide whether or not to keep going with the research. But very simply, if you are on a Tuesday, you're aiming for research on Friday, and you can't get your participants, maybe they have scheduling conflicts or something on Fridays. For example, like if you were working on an app for education and you wanted to work with elementary teachers, maybe they're really hard to schedule on Fridays. So you might have to adapt for that kind of reason. So to run through that list, you might come up with a new target group, a new set of customers, or a new kind of grouping of behaviors that you didn't know up front in the week that you really want to make sure you get right. I often see like the buyer being a forgotten user. So like who's the person who's going to buy this software? And they have different needs than the person who's like pulling the data out of the tool. So thinking through the lens of like all those different perspectives can be hard, and you often uncover them as you keep going through the sprint. As a researcher, please let us participate in the sprint. Oftentimes we get excluded. I've been in many a sprint where on Tuesday they say, okay, researcher, go do the scheduling, and I'm not in the conversation anymore. And so can you imagine missing like 20% of the discussion about where the product's going? Like I have valuable insights. I have customer insights I can pass on from previous experience. And I also it's really hard to catch up. So don't exclude your researcher. Make it a team effort if you are gonna do recruiting on Tuesday. But if you have the resources to do it, see if you can find someone else, like another researcher who's not part of the sprint team who can do the scheduling. Or do it as a group, or just move the research to afterward so that the researcher has some time to catch up on that. Research method, we talked a little bit about. A couple other forms of method that take more time are things like if you wanted to do a survey, you wanted to really understand that population. You're not going to be able to launch something within that week that's going to have meaningful results to act on. So you may want to move that before or after the sprint, depending on when you uncover that need. Participant schedules, I mentioned. A couple of ways I think about research in a pretty simple model. There's extensive research online, so if you have questions, I'm happy to point you to those resources for how to identify what tools to use from a research perspective. But I think of it as kind of 3 kinds of questions you might ask during a sprint. 1, who are my customers? You can find out by asking them in an interview and a survey, the methods you see up there. Ethnography, if you're not familiar, is a big word that means in the research context that maybe you're gonna go like follow them around in a non-creepy way at their workplace or at their home or whatever. And oftentimes that takes a lot of time to set up. It's very involved, but it can be very valuable. An example I'll share from my work is that we would do ethnography or contextual inquiries at the place of work of the people using our software. And it was really, really insightful to see like what sticky notes they have. Like what paths did they find so confusing in the product that they had to write it down? And a lot of people will have that. What are they doing today for this problem? Like if the tool exists, use analytics, figure out what the path looks like, figure out how many people are using it. Observation, watching people use your tool. I think this is the biggest opportunities that companies fail to take, is the opportunity to be critical of an existing product. Often they're so excited to sprint ahead to the next version of the product that they fail to take the opportunity to learn from what's broken today. So just by doing some usability studies on your current product, doesn't mean you have to like put that all in the queue and fix it if you're doing a new fix. You can take that and inform your sprint with the insights you gather. And then the last category is my solution making things better, easier, worse, harder. All of that are things that would happen after the sprint. So things like interviews at all points, all questions can be kind of approached or tackled through an interview. A prototype test to me is when you have either like a light software solution or you use InVision or Adobe and you have a prototype that feels real but doesn't have the supporting backend, that customers have a specific flow they have to go through and you moderate a session, you can learn from that. Usability research is kind of a take on prototype test, often it's with the existing product. And then A/B testing, there's 2 versions we talk about. There's qualitative A/B testing where you're in a lab and you're testing 2 different designs, which can be something that comes out of a sprint is like 2 really solid approaches and you want to evaluate it. Or you can do in the wild A/B testing with live customers using it, where half of them have one experience, half have the other. Any questions on this list of tools? Yeah.
What kind of tools do you use for A/B testing?
In terms of the software tools, if you're doing live testing, I think the most cost-effective tool in the market right now is Google Optimize, which there's a free version that you can use set up through Google Tag Manager. Optimizely, A/B Tasty, Monotape, there's a slew of them that are out there. And then a lot of tools will have like split testing for landing pages and things within the tool. They just won't be as robust. Yep.
So during ethnography, one thing we tried was the Google Clip one,
Mm-hmm.
just having them word around it. But one of the challenges sometimes with those is trying to make sense of all the data. Like if you have several users, it requires either someone looking at it and processing, and you probably will miss stuff. So how do you handle that, like in terms of how much workload is justifiable depending on the stage you're at? If you have anything to
Yeah, I would say the number one problem I see, I think it's similar to like why a sprint week is started with like deciding what you're going to do that week. And research is often decided on which method you do instead of what research question you're going to answer. So I would answer your question by saying, what's the goal of the research? You can't go out there and just like catch everything out in the ether about your customers and hope you happen upon it in the recording. If you go with a target goal of what you're trying to learn, I'm trying to understand like how teachers keep on top of their email, and like when they check their email, how often they check their email. Then you can have that more open-ended recording, and then just look for those moments.
Great, thank you.
There's one more.
If you try to do all this research in one day, I mean, don't you take the risk of not having enough data and going off and, I mean, the example I think of is, you know, as much as Apple software is cool and easy to use, the thing that drives me absolutely nuts about it is that they'll take something that works well, and then they'll come out with another iteration that's so different, it's hard to make the transition. Plus, some of the features you absolutely love, they take it away from you. And they do it over and over again, to the point where I say, the hell with it, I'm going to use Premiere instead of iMovie. You know, because at least that's predictable.
Yeah.
How do you avoid like making that mistake?
So I think I would break it into two different questions. So for your kind of the second part of your question around how do you help customers with drastic change or mitigate potential drastic change impacts, I think that's where day one, like knowing who your customer is and defining that group is really important, because it should give you a sense of how flexible they will be. So I think Apple's a hard case because they're trying to solve for all people using technology. But in most cases, you have a more narrow set of behaviors, and you might have a set of behaviors that are very adaptive and flexible, so you can take a bigger change, and maybe for other groups, you need to have a plan for how to transition them. And I think the first part of your question was how much research is useful, or can you do in a week?
How do you know when you've done enough? Because if you don't do enough, you might be designed just for a very small audience. You know?
Yeah, it's really hard. That's the answer. It's hard. I mean, I have experience in kind of figuring out what questions to ask and what's important when, but I still am surprised with research findings. So I would say that in the case of a sprint, it's like having a really well-defined goal and problem, and then being okay with failure. Like if on Friday your design fails, being okay with it, and like having a plan. And maybe that's a follow-up sprint, or having like a plan B design that you thought was good, things like that, where you can be okay with it not going perfectly. Because when you ask users, you're always going to find things that aren't perfect. We can't solve every person's problem with one thing. So there's a lot to it. How much research is enough? For me, it's triangulating data. If I have a quant source and a qual source pointing to the same problem, I feel good about acting on that information. It doesn't have to be perfect information. So I think sprints are a lot about being comfortable putting out solutions into the world that you don't have perfect data behind as well. So it's getting it enough, but not having to do it perfectly. Okay, I wanted to share a couple of the newer tools in the market on the research side that might be useful in the research context, especially if you can't get people in person. Respondent and user interviews are great tools for finding just like net new participants. Ethnio is a tool for recruiting within your own website. So it allows you to have a pop-up window, and that will control a database of all the people that you're working with. Lookback's a recording software. Hotjar does a little bit of a lot of things. It's a great low-cost tool. Check it out. It's got some analytics and some recording features. But I think that my most important takeaway is please stop asking your family and friends. When you do research, they're not going to tell you the truth. Find other sources. It's okay to go on Craigslist. Craigslist is better than your mom. Like, not in life, not for love, but like for research, talking to a stranger is going to be better than talking to someone who wants to make you feel good, because we're all biased. We all want to make people feel good. And if you walk up to someone and say, I just made this amazing product, I'm the CEO, I'm banked my entire life savings on it, I want you to tell me what's wrong with it. Are you going to tell me like 10 things that are wrong with it, or are you going to maybe say one and be like, oh, you got it, you got it, girl, you know?
You're working on it.
Yeah, you'll get it, you'll get there. So please like talk to other people. Okay, we're back to another discuss it. If you've done research and you've done a sprint, now that we've talked about all these different research things, how would you kind of incorporate some of these different tools that might be available to you into the next sprint you do? Please discuss.
Really quick.
Great. So I think the premise of the talk is around this next section. So you've made it. Here we go. So now I'm going to talk about beyond the week. And I don't really mean like only longer than a week. I mean different forms other than the 5 days. So I'm going to talk first about some levers that can change why, like may give you a motivation for why you'd want to change from those 5 days. And some of these we've talked about a little bit already. So the first one is number of teammates. And teammates mean like people who are going to participate in the sprint. It's not really possible to do a sprint with like 50 people. As you can tell, like there's a lot of conversation that's going to happen in a sprint. I think the recommended number is like 7 or 8 max. So if you have a lot of people involved, you can't really do it in 5 days, and you probably shouldn't try to do it in 5 days. Number of user group is another one I mentioned a couple times today, but to kind of elaborate on it, it's things like if you have a single problem you're focused on, but there are a lot of different lenses through which you need to solve it. For simplicity's sake, you can pick one user group for the week, but it may mean that on Friday you've solved for that group and you need to do another sprint to solve for the next group, but you've already made some progress towards solving it. So a reason you might expand or adapt the 5-day model is because, hey, there's a person who does reporting, there's a person who inputs the data, there's a person who like manages that team and needs to make sure they're doing their work and go in the tool to do that. And you're going to uncover all kinds of user groups for whatever software or product you're building. So that's one reason you might want to change how you sprint. I think this is the most common reason. Yes, Douglas.
So that brought up something I've seen before. So I think it might be helpful for some folks to know why you wouldn't just talk to those various different people on Friday rather than waiting to do another sprint to talk to that other type of person.
To talk to all of them? I think it's twofold. So from my perspective, you need to talk to 5 people of each user group to get a comprehensive or like a reasonable set of perspectives and the amount of variation you can get within a certain role. So if you were to try to accomplish, let's say you have 7 teammates and then you had 3 user groups, so you have 15 people you need to talk to for an hour each. That makes for a really long Friday and a lot of data that hasn't been passed back and forth. So I think it depends. To your point, if you have 2 user groups, maybe you do 3 from each group, you get a good read on how that's going, and then you could do follow-up research later. Maybe the groups aren't very different in their behaviors or their needs, so maybe a couple of interviews will get you started. I don't think there's a reason to hold off if you have identified them up front and you have time to do it and people to do it. I just have found in practice that it's very challenging to schedule all those people without kicking the researcher out of the room. or it's very expensive to do that all at once. So if budget's really tight to pay all those participants to come in or to get the lab or whatever your setup is, can add a lot of variables that make it more complicated. Just availability in general, stakeholders, like those people who have to sign off on what you're designing, they can be the hardest people to get in the room. Even if you're just trying to get them on Monday and on Friday, you may need to kind of split up those meetings, repeat your Friday presentation a few times, for example. Team member availability, hey, we've all got like standing meetings. How do we like get it so everyone's calendar is completely clear? Ideally, we do it, but if we can't, we might need to adapt. Researchers, please take care of us. That's all I'll say. And participants, I've talked about as well, that they have schedules, they have lives, maybe they have a job or a family or something that's going to prevent them from being available on Friday during the sprint week. If you're working with like an outside recruiting firm, you may be able to work around that because you'll have a larger pool to pull from. But if you're really constraining yourselves to doing the recruiting on Tuesday, scheduling it on Friday afternoon, you may need to be more flexible. And then the last one, which I say cautiously, because in a sprint you want to have a well-defined problem. And you don't want it to be really unknown or really big or really complex. But sometimes there are systems that the further you get into understanding them, you realize there's more and more complexity, or the scale of what you're doing needs to change. So I leave that in as a variable that can impact why you would decide to adapt from just 5 days. This is 4 out of 5, so this will be quick. But we have this one and one more, so enjoy it. So thinking about the ones, I'll flip it back over, but of the things on that list, which ones are either factors or the biggest factors for your team, either in doing sprints today or if you were to do them in the future? What might influence your ability to do the 5-day sprint? So go ahead, I'm going to flip that back and go ahead and chat.
Real or not? Segment view and yeah, it's always bringing it back. It's back. But it's still that. Everybody on board. You'll get how fast it can happen. Solid recreations here and west. Issues presented
He's gonna ring the bell. I like the bell a lot. All right. So we have one more of those sessions left. So anything you need to say to your partner, make sure you say it in the next one. All right. So I'm going to talk about two different methods that we use that adapted the 5-day sprint when I was at Google. And for both of these, I use them on different teams. Like as I mentioned at the beginning, like teams that were working on brand new things or existing things, like new customer base, like well-established base. And I think they work in both contexts with just some minor changes. So the first one I'd call iterative sprints, just like sprint week on repeat. Typically, we would run these for like 8 to 12 weeks. It kind of coincides with like the quarter system. If you think about like planning your goals for the quarter, do this for the middle, and then say you did it at the end. That's what this is. What I loved about this is that it really allows your team to like dig in and explore and fail. Like we don't fail enough as companies. Like too often we like put a really crappy product out and it fails in the market and it's a very visible failure. And this is a great way to like fail as a team and come up with innovative solutions. And then it also supports testing with multiple user types. So as Douglas had asked, like, hey, sometimes we try to like jam everybody in on Friday and do research with all these people. But in user research, we usually want to have 4 to 5 people of each representative like user behavior group or persona, if you want to call it that. So it can be, you don't want to have, for example, like one person doing reporting, one person who fills in the data, and one person who's the manager, because that's not going to give you multiple viewpoints. It's going to give you that one person's perspective. And where you learn in the qualitative research is by seeing multiple people attempt very similar things and understanding where the overlap is and then where the differences are. And that's where a lot of the value of qualitative research comes in. So pros and cons, when to do it, when not to do it. Great for exploring complex problems. It's really fun. You can get like really deep, really creative, really figure out what's working in that problem space. I find that the best solutions, the most interesting things I've ever built come from these, because your team is like, we're all doing it together, we're getting it done, and for like 8 weeks we're like really eating and sleeping and thinking about it in the shower, and like everything we do is about this problem. And so it really gives us a chance to like iterate and think creatively and tackle things. It also allows us to be inclusive of user types and needs. Oftentimes like questions of like, can people who have like a color disability see these things? Like that's not gonna often come up in a sprint, and it will give you a chance to explore like, are you ADA compliant? Are you thinking about someone who would be driving in their car on their phone versus somebody sitting on the subway on their phone, and how like different experiences and environments might play with the way the customer or the user's goals evolve. Of course, this is super time resource intensive. It's hard to get sign off on it. There's diminishing returns as you have more weeks. So it's really important that you don't have a room of perfectionists, because you do not want to spend a week saying, should the button be blue? And then next week say the button should be red. That was a waste of time. Do not do that. Do an A/B test if you have to find that out. But make sure that you set that goal at the beginning and then know when to cut it off. I would never start with this. I would always start with a 5-day. Make sure you've got like, your team trust, you've got a really interesting space and problem, and you've got buy-in to do it. And the other thing you can do with iterations is that because it's going on week after week, it doesn't have to be 5 full days for 8 weeks. Like that'd be a lot of time to be with your colleagues, like sitting and brainstorming. Like that's a lot. So really what we would do is we would do like a traditional sprint week, 5 days at the beginning with a meeting. That would be like very social. We'd go out for drinks. It was about bonding and not so much about necessarily solving and doing research on day 5. But then by the next week and for the following weeks, we would typically do some design work Monday and Tuesday, research on Wednesday, kind of react to the research, talk about it on Thursday, and then start building it back up for the next week of research. And really that can be done in like a couple hours a day. So you're not thinking about like, we have to be in the same room, we have to be whiteboarding the whole time. You can really balance the other needs that you might have at your work when you use this model. Any question about iterative sprints? Yeah.
Does the time lapse introduce external change in the process? Because when you do it in 1 week, kind of things remain more or less constant. But when you do it over 8 to 12 weeks, is there a complexity added as things change?
Things are changing. I think it really depends on what you're solving for. Okay. I would say in general, like human needs don't change that much in 6 to 8 weeks. Like in general, we're not going to find that that window is going to add that complexity. So I haven't encountered any products, but I'd be happy to talk about it afterward if you have ideas on what it could be. But in general, that you get more and more data about more experiences, which is useful. Yeah.
So what happens if during this time, so I'm assuming you keep the same team, but you find the A/B, like 2 branching paths, and you need to split up, because probably that you'll feel like you have the time. Did you, in your experience, was it more about like, let's try to stick as a team and commit to one? Or
we always stuck as a team, but some weeks we would split it into 2 designs. So it would always be constrained to a week. We would never split for multiple weeks, but we might say this week we're going to do 10 participants, 5 will see one design, 5 will see the other, and we're going to have totally different ideas that we explore. And that, yes, we would kind of split off to go make that prototype. But we make sure the flows are the same. We have the same number of participants see each of them.
And would you follow the same team composition that Jake recommends in the book of like?
When you get to the iterative sprints, it's generally hard to keep teams at that scale. So I've found that they tend to be like 4 to 6 people when you get to this time scale. But if you have a big team that's collaborative and you can do it,
share the designer.
More perspectives is good.
Share the designer.
Share the designer. Maybe have 2 designers if you're A/B testing. But yeah. And then the second form I wanted to cover today is what I call short form. This to me is my like, go-to when I go to a company and they've like, never done a sprint, they've heard about it, they kind of want to do it, but then they hear that it's 5 days and they're like, how do we possibly do that? 2 to 4 hours, you usually can make that happen, even if it's like 3 months out. You just get on the calendar and clear the calendar, make people show up. It's a highly condensed version of the sprint. It's really important to have consensus on what the problem is before you walk into that meeting. If you walk into that meeting and people are like, I don't believe it's a problem, or prove it to me that it's a problem, it's not going to work, you're not going to have anything useful, cancel the meeting. Like, have a meeting about the problem, you know? Don't spend 4 hours talking about a problem with that group. So assume that you do have that problem, share the data ahead of time so people can question it and have discussion asynchronously before they come into this meeting, because you want to start the meeting, first 30 minutes, you run through that data, qualitative, quantitative, anything that is signaling that this is a problem, and you want everyone in the room to nod their heads and be like, yep, we're in agreement. and then you spend the rest of the time brainstorming. It's just that sketch phase. You may do the vote at the end. I generally find that it's good to leave that final solution open-ended for a design team, because if you hand a designer like a really here you go, designer that has never been in this room before, please design this thing, they're gonna not understand what happened in that meeting. So it's good to have a designer that was in the room, and it's good to keep it flexible because designers will uncover new things that didn't come out in that 2-hour meeting. And you wanna basically say, we're passing the buck, we believe you can do it, we've got your back, and that's the output of the meeting.
I have a question about that.
Yes, please.
So assuming you're going into this meeting knowing the problem, is that a problem that you defined through your research ahead of time with like their earlier, are they giving you documentation and stuff like that? Are you doing your own research and then jumping in at a place of already understanding the problem from a research perspective? Or are you taking what they have told you is the problem that you need to solve before going to the meeting?
I've seen it done both ways. As a researcher, I'll say research-based problems are usually better. But it definitely is going to happen where it's like top-down management or like team voting. There's lots of ways to arrive at what the problem is. You're not necessarily going to get it right for that it's the most important problem, but that problem could still exist in a regular sprint week. But you will have consensus and data to back it up before you do it. So you don't want to say, this is a problem, we'll figure it out in a meeting. You want to have some evidence. Douglas.
I love this for internal meetings or decisions that you need to make that are going to impact only the internal team.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really need to do research because you have all the constituents in the meeting. It's a very effective way to make decisions quickly rather than just saying, oh, well, we didn't come to consensus, so let's move on. And it's just meeting after meeting and nothing ever happens. So this doesn't have to be for product or customer facing stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think riffing off that a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily call it like a short form sprint, but you could consider like this meeting, the goal of this meeting is to define the problem. And that may have a different group of people than like this goal of the meeting is to define possible solutions, and this meeting is to evaluate the solutions. And I think that's another like viable option for using a lot of the sprint structure. What I love about this is that people have fun. Like people walk out of this meeting and they're smiling and they like their coworkers more and they feel like they're part of the process. They feel like they did a sprint and they actually really don't have a whole lot of impact on like the final visual design or the UX design, but they feel really bought in and they're really excited to see it to come into fruition. So for me, this is a great consensus tool. It's a great like buy-in tool. Like we're a team, we've got it. We're not going to fight marketing team versus design team versus research and engineer. We're all going to be at the table and like give our thumbs up that we're going to tackle this. See, my #1 pro, establish that buy-in. You can also have a lot more people in the room. People can like sketch silently to themselves and everybody does a little presentation around the table. I would say I've done like up to 30 people. It feels like a lot, but it was fine. But I think like 15 to 20 works comfortably, where people can talk a little bit more. It is great for meeting heavy cultures where blocking off your calendar is hard. I heard in one of the discussions like, hey, we did this great sprint, and then we got to work on Monday, and there was like no time for follow-ups because I was so busy catching up on my email and like catching up on the meetings I missed, and like I've now felt behind. And so I think this is a good workaround where you just like clear out your calendar, you still can do your email, you still can go to the other boring meetings, and you can have like a fun meeting. Bring lunch, like sketch some stuff out, it's more fun. Cons though, design and research is done in isolation. A lot of value to like seeing that process and experiencing it. Go to the full sprint for that value. And then I think a really important part is that changing paths can be really difficult. So like once you get on a certain path in a 5-day sprint, hey, Wednesday, we're all in this together, we all trust each other, we're all exploring, and we have this revelation that's just not gonna work. We've gotta like trash our thing, start over, we'll get it done by Friday. It doesn't quite work with the short form. You kind of have to start over and like reestablish the problem and like reestablish the sketching. So it can be hard to really drastically change the path of what you're doing using it. So reminder, short form, sprint, great for meeting cultures, like your first time introducing sprints in a culture where like it's just not part of what you do. Iterative sprints, great for like diverse audiences or complex problems or like where it's safe to fail and find really interesting solutions. And then the 5-day sprint, start here. Yes?
What does the structure look like for that short form sprint? Like which exercises do you keep, which ones do you drop? Like at a high level, give a...
Yeah, it's more like a condensed day one with like the research and the interviews cut out. So like that's all presented up front. And then I would say the breakdown really depends on the energy in the room, but I would say like 30 minutes reviewing the data you know, going through the brainstorming, like a lot of those exercises around building consensus on like how to approach it and different hypotheses you can test, and then like some voting or discussion at the end. So I typically have it be like, I'm presenting at the beginning, we're all talking, then we're quiet, doing some sketching, and then we come back and talk again. So that's like 30 minutes on each thing.
Okay, so do you do like storyboards, or do you leave that for one side?
It really depends on the problem. Storyboards work pretty well for communicating ideas, I think, so it can work. People love sticky notes, so anything between that. Yes?
So Aging and Smart has something called the Lightning Decision Jam, which I think would qualify for a short form sprint. So that's something you can check out.
All right, last discuss it. You can talk about this, or you can talk about anything else with your partner, but talk about ways that you might adapt the next design sprint you do based on what you talked about today.
Well, what do you take away from this? What do you
Last slide, we're almost done. All right, this is your challenge / homework from me. Please do it, but I'm not going to check, and there's no grade. One, write down something that you talked about today, or you thought about today. And you can write it down now, you can write it down later, but write down something you're going to do related to sprints, and then do it. And then tell us how it went, because it's fun to know. Sprintstories.com, Voltage Control also has a bunch of great stories, but sprintstories.com is great for inspiration for like other brands and things that aren't in Austin if you're looking for some new inspiration. And then come back and like tell us what you learned, send us an email, chat with me after, whatever, tell me like none of it's applicable. I love feedback, open to feedback. So that's the homework. Any questions on homework before we close out?
When does it do?
When does it due? Whoever sends it to me first will get a high five. And that's it. Thank you so much. So if there,
You want to take some questions?
yeah, does anyone have, we did a lot of chatting, but if anyone has other questions, anything at all, or things that we talked about, yeah.
You say you go in the research whole design team, right? That works, for the whole week. But then, how would you utilize UX designers, visual designers, and stuff like that, right? You said like the whole team works on one topic, but I mean, you can read the visual before you do UX and stuff like that.
Oh, how does it work when you have different skill sets
Yeah. Let's say
working?
you have, let's say you have one researcher,
Yep.
two UX designers, one visual, and one front end developer.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think oftentimes like in a sprint we're like, it's really fun to wear other hats. Like I love building prototypes, and I'm not a visual designer, I'm not an engineer. Like it's not a great prototype, but I like being part of it. So I think in some ways it's like a nice way to be able to experiment. But if you're doing it for 8 weeks or 12 weeks, it doesn't make sense to keep that amount of like experimenting with new roles. So the way that we often handled it was like we'd have a morning stand up and talk about what we were going to get done that day, and then like an afternoon one. And so we would like divide up the responsibilities based on your skills. And what it often in that like the 6 to 8 weeks sprint model, what often would happen is that at the same time we'd be handing the paper prototypes off to the designer, the researchers would go recruit. And so we've already all agreed on what the flow will be. We've all decided like where the things will be. And so it's just a matter of like digitalizing it and prototyping it. And then we're going, and we've already agreed on who the participants are, what the research questions are. And so we go do our part, and then we come back and share it at the beginning and end of each day. So that's the way that we handled it. Yeah. Yep.
Considering like the ramp up time to give context and to get the person to understand the problem,
Mm-hmm.
do you have you seen it worthwhile to bring on an external facilitator?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of value in not like stumbling through a sprint.
Yeah.
If you are like new to sprints and you're like looking at the book the whole time, your brain is thinking about the book and you're thinking about being facilitator. And if you have like 3 people in the room being like, we're gonna all learn it together, like nobody's fully focused on the problem at hand.
Yeah.
So in general, I think that, I think it's also true in the research side. It's like really valuable to like bring in an outside researcher, the fresh perspective to run the research so that you and your team can like watch it and observe it.
Yeah.
It's not to say like you have to have a researcher outside or you have to have a facilitator every time, but there's a lot of value in offloading those pieces and just like taking in the
Especially if
information.
it's new to your organization.
Particularly if it's new, yeah.
Do you have any suggestions
that.
for sourcing a facilitator for a short form sprint on a budget?
Yeah.
So one of the most common challenges I've found is that
Were you a planted question?
That's a great idea.
That was amazing. Yeah.
So one of the biggest challenges we've had is that sometimes not everyone who participated in the sprint can follow up on building it and making it happen.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some advice or things that you've some best practices for keeping them connected and excited? Because they're like great ambassadors most of the time.
Yeah.
They're like please test this, or like, oh my god, this is so cool.
Yeah.
They're usually really good for keeping that.
Yeah.
But are there any like
ways to
things that
involve
you've seen?
them.
Yeah, recommended things that you've seen,
Yeah.
like this is a great way to keep them in the loop or bring them in for testing or prototyping thing.
Yeah.
Just 1 hour.
I think there's a lot to be said about treating your sprint, like whatever you're building, as like a little mini startup and treating them as an advisor. So a lot of startups will like send out a newsletter and be like, hey, here's the latest thing we worked on, or here's what we learned from participants, and have this like summary thing. And I've done the same thing within a sprint model. So like those people who are really invested will have a chance to hear what's coming up. Maybe you'll have some call outs of like, hey, come watch our sessions, or hey, if you want to be like an insider doing some of the what I'd call a pilot session. So like you do a pilot session on the research before you run the real sessions to make sure all the questions work.
Hmm.
They could be a decent person for that. You just don't use the data, but they get the benefit of seeing what you're working on, and you get the benefit of testing out your
A
script.
great smoke test.
Yeah, it's a smoke
And
test.
they're familiar
guinea pig.
with it enough that they'll be like,
They
This
might
is leading.
question,
Like
yeah.
you're leading back
Yeah.
here.
So it depends on their skill set, I'd say, and what their interests are. But I think treating them as an advisor and whatever that means within your company makes sense. If you do have that kind of every morning you do a stand up, maybe they're still invited to those and can come when they can, just so they get a rhythm of what's happening. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Cool. So I want to make sure we announce the winners, and hey, I'm going to ask your help for this.
Yeah.
And before we do, I just want to point out, AJ spent a lot of time talking about design sprints tonight, but definitely want to remind you all that she's an amazing research tool, resource here in Austin. And you're not a tool, sorry. Whether you're trying to augment your existing capabilities, or if you're wanting to start a research group that you don't have those resources, or even if you're trying to educate them, I think it's amazing that we have her here in town, and so definitely take advantage of it. So with that, let's choose a winner. So I'm gonna have Eli's got the list. Could you pick 3 numbers between 1 and 50?
1 and 50.
Yeah.
23.
23. So who's the first winner of Jake Knapp tickets? 23.
Good job
It's gonna
filling it out,
be
guys.
it's gonna be Kate Moon.
Kate Moon?
Okay.
Yay!
Cool.
All right, next number.
Okay.
12.
All right, Adrian Tavares.
Adrian.
Yeah. Cool.
And we're going to do one more giveaway. We have voltage control t-shirts. So, right there.
Not this one.
No, well, unless you're a medium. If you're a medium, it's going to happen.
One more number.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't say 12 or 23 again. I'm mad.
Yes.
Yeah, again? How much will you pay me for saying this? Just kidding. Let's go with 47.
All right, and we've got Courtney Davis Schramm.
Awesome. Cool. So, winners, just come see me, or if you got to run out, just email me, and we'll get it taken care of.
Cool.
Thanks so much for coming tonight.
Yeah,
Awesome. Good job, AJ. That was like ridiculous trying to sort through the names that shared it. And we gotta find a better way to do that though.
Yeah, I just very unique to this.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to
Yeah,
so now I'm starting a new role.
Okay.
There's already been design people.
Yeah, I have a friend on
Accelerator. Yes, so I'm starting on the 17th.
I'm like, send me a note. So I'm actually with my friend who worked with about a year. Some of the UX copy team, and he would be.
You know if he's on the digital accelerator, because I think that's a lot of the experimentation. Yeah, that would be fantastic. Because then I'm just trying to take all those things that are applied now, trying to build great products for us.